I am the son of a modest yet scholarly clergyman from the western regions of England. Though these particulars may seem irrelevant, I mention them only briefly. My father, a man of deep learning, never mastered the deceptive charm needed to gain favor with influential individuals, nor did he ever stoop to the ignoble craft of promoting himself. His love for ancient traditions and rituals, along with an unmatched generosity and a deep, sincere spirituality, earned him the love and respect of the rural community he served. However, such traits were not the ones that typically led to higher positions within the church. So, by the age of 60, he remained the humble priest of the small parish he had accepted 3 decades earlier. The income from this position was barely sufficient to maintain the appearance expected of a cleric in the Church of England. And so, when he passed away a few years ago, I, his only child, was left to face the world alone, with less than £100 to my name and the daunting challenge of securing a livelihood. There seemed to be no opportunities for me in the countryside, and like many in my situation, I was irresistibly drawn to London. One August morning, with dew still glistening on the grass and the high green hedgerows of the winding lane, a kindly neighbor took me by cart to the railway station. With that, I bid farewell to the land of sweeping moors and the eerie stone formations of the tors. By 6 o'clock we approached the outskirts of London. The sour scent of the brickworks near Acton drifted through the open carriage windows, and a heavy mist began to rise from the fields. Glimpses of one identical street after another left me with an impression of bleak repetition. The air became increasingly oppressive, and as we passed beneath rows of drab, run-down houses with unkempt backyards lining the tracks near Paddington, I felt as though I might suffocate in London's lifeless atmosphere. I hired a hansom cab and rode into the city, but each street only deepened my sense of despair. Rows of dull buildings with their curtains drawn, nearly deserted roads, and weary pedestrians shuffling along, all combined to weigh on my spirit. That night, I took lodging in a modest inn just off the Strand, the same one where my father had stayed during his rare visits to the capital. After supper, I ventured out, but the lively scenes of the Strand and Fleet Street offered me little comfort. In all the vast expanse of this metropolis, not a single soul could I call a friend or even an acquaintance. I won't trouble you with a detailed account of the year that followed, as the misfortunes of a man who descends into hardship are too common to hold much interest. My savings quickly dwindled. I discovered that unless I was well dressed, no one would even give me an audience, and I needed to reside in a respectable neighborhood if I hoped to be treated with basic courtesy. I applied for many positions, most of which I now realize I was wholly unfit for. I attempted to work as a clerk despite having no understanding of business or its routines, and I quickly learned that survival in the city demanded more than desperation and a will to try. To my dismay, I soon discovered that a broad familiarity with literature and an atrocious handwriting style were hardly considered assets in the business world. I had recently enjoyed reading one of the finest novels by a well-known author of our time and began frequenting the taverns of Fleet Street, hoping to forge connections within literary circles. I believed such introductions were essential to anyone hoping to embark on a writing career. Unfortunately, I was mistaken. On a few occasions, I tried to start conversations with gentlemen seated nearby, and though they responded with courtesy, their tone made it clear that my approach was out of the ordinary. Gradually, my modest funds dwindled away, pound by pound. I could no longer afford to maintain appearances. I moved into a quieter, less respectable area, and my meals became more ritual than nourishment. I would leave my room at 1 o'clock and return by 2, having consumed nothing but a small cake. In this way, I became well acquainted with hardship. I remember one particularly bitter moment. Sitting on a bench in Hyde Park, surrounded by slush and patches of ice, nibbling on a crust of bread, I fully grasped the harsh sting of poverty and the despair of a man fallen far below the status even of a wanderer. Despite repeated setbacks, I did not abandon hope. I scoured the advertisement sections in newspapers, kept a constant lookout for any opportunity, and peered into the shop windows of stationers for possible openings, but to no avail. Then, one evening, while reading in a free library, my eyes fell upon an intriguing advertisement in a paper. It read something like this: "Wanted, A gentleman seeks a secretary and assistant with literary skill and taste. Must be open to travel. Naturally, I assumed that such a position would attract a flood of applications, and my chance of securing it seemed slim. Nevertheless, I decided to write to the gentleman, Mr. Smith, who was then staying at a prominent West End hotel. My heart leapt when, a couple of days later, I received a note requesting that I call at the Cosmopole Hotel at my earliest convenience. Sir, I don't know what experiences life may have presented to you, so I cannot guess whether you felt such a moment. But I can only describe my own. A slight queasiness, a quickened heartbeat, a dry throat, and difficulty speaking. These sensations accompanied me as I made my way to the hotel. I had to repeat the name Smith twice before the hall porter understood, and as I climbed the stairs, my palms were damp with sweat. I was quite struck when I finally met Mr. Smith. He appeared to be younger than I was, with a gentle and hesitant demeanor that immediately caught my attention. He had been reading when I entered and looked up upon hearing my name. "My dear sir," he said with warmth, "I am truly pleased to meet you. I read your letter with great interest. May I ask, was this written in your own hand?" He held up the letter I had sent. I assured him that I had written it myself and jokingly remarked that I was not in a position to afford a secretary of my own. "Well then," he replied, "the position I advertised is yours, if you are still interested. You have no objection to travel, I assume?" he asked. Naturally, I accepted the offer without hesitation. And so, I became Mr. Smith's assistant. During the initial few weeks, there were no specific tasks assigned to me. I was paid a full quarter's salary in advance, and a generous sum was allotted in place of food and lodging. Then, one morning, upon arriving at the hotel as instructed, Mr. Smith informed me that I should prepare for a sea voyage. To skip over the less relevant details, within 2 weeks we had arrived in New York. Mr. Smith explained that he was working on a highly specialized project, one that required unusual and particular investigations. I came to understand that our destination lay far in the western regions of the country. We spent roughly a week in New York before embarking on what would become an incredibly long and exhausting train journey. Day blended into night, and night into day, as the train moved steadily across the continent. We traveled through countless towns and cities, many of whose names I had never even heard before. The journey took us over precarious bridges, along the edges of mountain ranges, and deep into endless forests of pine and brush. Much of the landscape seemed to repeat itself endlessly, with the same dull undergrowth stretching mile after mile. The ceaseless clatter of the train wheels along poorly laid tracks made conversation difficult and added to the weariness of the ride. The passengers were a constantly shifting mix, with new faces boarding and old ones departing at nearly every stop. On more than one occasion, I was startled awake in the dead of night by the harsh screech of the brakes. Peering out the window, I would find the train paused in some small, rough-looking town, its streets dimly lit by the harsh glow from barroom windows. A handful of curious onlookers would gather to peer at the train. Occasionally, passengers would disembark, and at times a few more would step aboard, waiting on the creaking wooden platforms. Many among the travelers were fellow countrymen from England, ordinary families uprooted from homes their ancestors had lived in for generations, all chasing hopes of prosperity in the distant American wilderness or among the Rockies. I overheard conversations between the men, sharing dreams of the fortunes to be made from fertile, untouched lands. A few who were tradesmen spoke enthusiastically about the high wages promised in the American railway and manufacturing industries. But these hopeful discussions often trailed off into silence after only a short while. I began to notice a kind of quiet unease spreading among them, an unspoken realization that they had stepped away from all that was familiar into a future that was still dark and unknown. The expressions on the faces of those men, as they gazed out at the bleak stretches of scrubland or the endless prairie dotted sparsely with timber frame houses, lacking gardens, flowers, or a single tree, betrayed their growing sense of regret. These lonely homes seemed adrift in a frozen, motionless ocean of dull gray, as if caught in a perpetual stillness. Each passing day brought more of the same, an unbroken, undulating skyline and the depressing monotony of a landscape drained of shape, color, or variation. It weighed heavily on the hearts of us Englishmen. One night, while lying awake, I overheard a woman quietly weeping. Between sobs, she questioned what mistake she had made to end up in such a barren, unfamiliar place. Her husband tried to soothe her, speaking in a thick Gloucestershire accent. He spoke of the land's richness, saying one only had to turn the soil and sunflowers would sprout unbidden. But she only wept harder, longing for her mother, their small cottage, and the beehives of their old life. Her grief was as innocent and unrestrained as a child's. That moment captured the profound sadness that had begun to surround us all. I found myself too heavy-hearted to dwell on anything else, not even to consider what business Mr. Smith might have in such a remote and desolate land, or what kind of literary work might be pursued amid such wilderness. Occasionally, I found it strange to reflect on my circumstances. I had been hired as a literary assistant with generous pay, and yet I remained a stranger to the man who employed me. Mr. Smith rarely spoke during the journey. At times he would approach me with casual remarks about the countryside, but for the most part, he kept to himself, appearing lost in thought. It was, I believe, on the 5th day since leaving New York that I was finally informed we'd soon be leaving the train. I had been observing a range of distant mountains rising wild and rugged on the horizon, wondering whether anyone could truly call such a place home, when Mr. Smith gently tapped my shoulder. "I imagine you're quite ready to be finished with train travel, Mr. Wilkins," he said. "You were watching the mountains, I see? With any luck, we'll reach them tonight. The train stops at a place called Reading, and I trust we'll find our way from there." A few hours later, the train came to a halt at the Reading depot. We stepped down onto the platform. I immediately noticed that, while the town was constructed mostly of wooden frame buildings, it was larger and livelier than any we had passed through in the last couple of days. The station itself was bustling. As the bell rang and the whistle blew, people moved in every direction, some disembarking, others preparing to board. The crowd included not only passengers but also those who had come to greet or bid farewell to friends and family. Mixed among them were idlers and curious onlookers. Several of our fellow English passengers also left the train at Reading, but in the confusion, they quickly disappeared from view. Mr. Smith signaled for me to follow, and soon we were pushing through the throng. The air was filled with noise, the constant chiming of bells, a din of voices, piercing whistles, and the hissing of steam releasing from the engine. It was all so disorienting that I found myself blindly trailing after my employer, uncertain where we were headed or how we would navigate this unfamiliar land. Mr. Smith had placed a wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes, blending in with the rest of the crowd, as many of the men wore the same style. It was only with some difficulty that I managed to keep sight of him amid the chaos. Eventually, we broke free from the crowd, and Mr. Smith turned down a side street, taking a couple of quick turns through narrow alleys. Dusk had settled by then, and we seemed to have entered a less frequented part of the town. The streets were poorly lit and sparsely populated, and those few people we did pass struck me as rough and unwelcoming in appearance. Abruptly, we stopped in front of a corner house. A man stood in the doorway, clearly expecting someone. He and Smith exchanged quick, knowing glances. "Come from New York, haven't you?" "Yes, from New York," Smith replied. "Good. Everything's ready, you can take them when you want. I've got my instructions, and I intend to see this through." "Very well, Mr. Evans. That's exactly what we want. You'll find our money's good. Bring them around." I stood silently, puzzled by their conversation and trying to grasp its meaning. Smith started pacing restlessly along the pavement while the man, Evans, remained at his doorway. After giving a sharp whistle, Evans took a long, quiet look at me, as though committing my face to memory. While I was still wondering what was happening, a lanky, unkempt boy came out from a narrow alleyway, leading 2 lean horses. "Mount up, Mr. Wilkins, and make it quick," Smith instructed. It's time we were on our way. Without further delay, we set off into the deepening night. Before long, I looked back to see the flatlands stretching behind us, the lights of the town flickering faintly in the distance. Ahead, the silhouette of the mountains loomed large. Smith led confidently along the uneven trail, as if he were strolling through the familiar streets of London, and I followed, doing my best to keep up. Fatigue weighed heavily on me, and I paid little attention to my surroundings. The trail climbed steadily, and now and again I could make out large rocks beside the path. The journey left only faint impressions in my memory. I vaguely recall passing through a thick, black pine forest, where the horses carefully maneuver between stones, and I remember the thin, sharp air as we continued to ascend into higher altitudes. I believe I must have dozed off for part of the ride, because I was startled when Smith said, "Here we are, Wilkins. This is Blue Rock Park. You'll appreciate the scenery in the morning. For now, let's eat and get some rest." A man stepped out of a rough-built house to take the horses, and we went inside, where a simple meal of fried steak and some harsh whiskey awaited us. I had arrived in a strange, unfamiliar place. The house consisted of just 3 rooms, the one where we ate, Smith's quarters, and my own. An elderly, deaf man who handled the chores slept in a shed attached to the building. When I awoke the next morning and stepped outside, I discovered that the house was nestled in a hollow amid the mountains. Scattered clusters of pine trees and massive bluish-gray boulders scattered through the area gave the place its name, Blue Rock Park. Snow-covered peaks surrounded us on all sides, and the mountain air was as invigorating as strong wine. I climbed a nearby slope, and from the top, looking out over the terrain, I felt as if I had been marooned on a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. As far as I could tell, the only sign of human presence was the log house I had slept in. I didn't yet realize that there were other similar houses scattered across the region, though spaced far apart by Rocky Mountain standards. At that moment, an overwhelming sense of desolate isolation washed over me. The vast plain, stretching endlessly, and the great expanse of sea that separated me from the world I once knew seemed to constrict around me. I wondered if I might die there, in that isolated mountain hollow. It was a terrifying moment, one I've never quite been able to shake off. But eventually I managed to push through the fear. I told myself that such an experience would only make me stronger, and resolved to make the best of it. The life I led was undeniably rough, both the living conditions and the food. I was left to my own devices most of the time. Smith was an almost unseen figure. I rarely encountered him, and it was often a surprise to find him around the house. On many occasions, I thought he was off somewhere, only to find him appearing from his room, locking the door behind him and slipping the key into his pocket. Sometimes, when I assumed he was occupied, I'd notice his boots covered in dust, as though he had been out in the dirt. As far as work was concerned, I was given no real tasks. My days consisted of little more than wandering the valley, eating and sleeping. Gradually, I became accustomed to this life, and I made myself as comfortable as possible. I even began to venture further away from the house, exploring the surrounding countryside. One day, I found myself in a neighboring valley, and unexpectedly stumbled upon a group of men sawing timber. Hoping that perhaps one of them might be an Englishman, or at least someone who spoke the same language, I approached them. The old man who helped with the housework, though he was often in my presence, was deaf, blind, and mute to me, so he was no company at all. I expected a rough, but at least somewhat friendly reception. Yet the men's cold stares and curt responses left me astonished. They exchanged wary glances, and one of the men, who had paused his work, began to fiddle with a gun, making it clear that I wasn't welcome. Disheartened, I turned back, cursing my fate for bringing me to a place where people seemed even more hostile than the wild animals. The loneliness of my existence began to feel suffocating, like a waking nightmare. A few days later, I made up my mind to walk to a small station a few miles away, where a simple inn catered to hunters and travelers. Occasionally, English gentlemen stopped there, and I thought that perhaps I would find someone with a more familiar and civilized manner than the locals. When I arrived at the inn, just as I had anticipated, I found a group of men gathered outside the log cabin, talking in low voices. As I drew closer, I noticed their eyes flicking toward each other, exchanging silent looks. By the time I was within earshot, the 7 or 8 trappers who were lounging about had fixed me with cold, hostile stares. Their expressions mirrored the repulsion one might feel at the sight of a venomous snake. I couldn't stand it any longer, and in frustration, I called out, "Is there anyone here who speaks English? Is there anyone here with a touch of decency or a bit of civilization?" I called out. One of the men reached toward his belt, but the person beside him stopped him and replied, "You'll soon find out we've got our own brand of civilization around here, mister, though I doubt you'll be too fond of it. But anyhow, there's an Englishman staying here, and I'm sure he'll be interested in seeing you. There he is, Mr. Auberon." A young man appeared at the doorway. He looked the part of a classic English gentleman, dressed as if from a countryside estate. One of the locals pointed toward me and said, "That's the man we were talking about last night. Thought you'd like to get a look at him, and here he is." At first glance, the young man's face had a kind expression, but it quickly darkened. He looked at me with clear disdain and then turned his back as if in contempt. "Sir," I called out, "I don't understand why I'm being treated this way. We are both Englishmen. I expected at least a little civility." He gave me a hard, cold look and started to go inside, but then hesitated, turned again, and addressed me. "You're being quite reckless acting like this," he said. "Perhaps you're relying on people's patience, but that patience won't last. It might vanish sooner than you think. Let me be frank. You may carry an English name and claim English roots, but don't expect any kind of support from that connection. If I were in your place, I wouldn't remain here much longer." He disappeared into the building, and the men around me simply stared in silence, watching my reaction like spectators at a cruel spectacle. I stood there, stunned, wondering if I had truly lost my mind. Just then, the woman who ran the place came outside. She looked at me as if I were some sort of wild animal. I turned to her and quietly said, "I'm very hungry and thirsty. I've walked a long way. I have money. Could you give me something to eat and drink?" "No, I won't," she said bluntly. "You'd best be on your way." Wounded and humiliated, I dragged myself back home and collapsed on the bed. Everything around me was a grim enigma. Rage, shame, and a growing fear filled my chest. Not long afterward, as I passed another house in a nearby valley, I saw children playing outside. The moment they noticed me, they screamed and scattered as though I were some monstrous creature. I couldn't bear the isolation. I needed to occupy myself with something, anything. If I sat idly in that dismal place, staring at the mountains all day, I would go mad. Yet every time I encountered people, I saw the same loathing in their eyes, the same hateful glares. One time, while walking through a thick patch of undergrowth, I heard the crack of a gun and the terrifying whistle of a bullet fly past my ear. Then, one day, I overheard something that shook me to the core. I was resting behind a boulder when two men came along the path and stopped nearby. One of them got tangled in a mess of wild vines and cursed loudly. The other laughed and said, "They're useful things now and then." "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, not much. Just saying these vines are damn tough. Sometimes rope's hard to come by, and prices are high." The man who had been swearing let out a dark chuckle. I heard them sit down and strike matches to light their pipes. "Seen him lately?" asked the one who had made the joke. "Saw him not long ago. Took a shot, but missed. Bullet flew high. He's lucky, like his master, but luck runs out. You heard about him showing up at Jinx's? Tried to get some help, but that young Brit knocked him down hard." "What's going on, really?" "Not sure, but it's going to end soon and in the old way too. You know how things go when tempers flare around here. Seen it done plenty. Ropes one way, fires another." "Yeah, I've seen that. Couple gallons of kerosene might cost $1 at Brown's shop, but I reckon that's cheap for what it does." They walked off, and I stayed hidden behind the rock, drenched in sweat, my hands trembling. I felt too sick to move. Eventually, I stood and hobbled home, using my stick for support, moving at the pace of an old man. I was sure they had been talking about me. I understood then, a grim fate was closing in. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed on my rough mattress, haunted by questions I couldn't answer. Sometime deep in the night, unable to bear it any longer, I got up, dressed, and walked out into the cold. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to keep moving, to exhaust myself. The moon was bright, and after a couple of hours I realized I was approaching a notorious place in the mountains. A deep ravine called Black Gulf Canyon. Long ago, a group of English travelers had camped there. Surrounded by native warriors, they had met a tragic fate. The story told of them being seized, subjected to unthinkable cruelty, and ultimately killed in ways too horrific to describe. Even the toughest trappers and seasoned woodsmen avoided that ravine completely. Some wouldn't go near it even in broad daylight. As I pushed my way through the tangled undergrowth above the canyon, I suddenly caught the sound of voices. Curious who might be in such a forsaken place at such an hour, I moved forward with care, treading lightly and trying not to make a sound. At the edge of the cliff stood a massive tree. I lay flat behind its thick trunk and peered out. Below me was the infamous Black Gulf Canyon, bathed in silver light from the moon high above. The glow reached even the canyon's depths, but it also cast sharp, pitch-black shadows across the jagged rocks. On the opposite side, sheer cliffs hung over the gulf, cloaked in total darkness. Now and then, thin clouds drifted across the moon, dimming the light, while a cold, biting wind whistled sharply through the chasm. As I lay there, I counted 20 men gathered in a half-circle around a flat rock below. I recognized many of them. They were the worst of the worst, men whose names would shame even the darkest slums of London. Some of them were already stained with murder, and others with deeds even more vile. Standing opposite them was Mr. Smith. In front of him, on the rock, stood a large pair of scales like those used in general stores. His voice echoed through the canyon, chilling me to the bone. "Gold for life," he shouted. "A life in exchange for gold. For each pound of gold, a man's blood. A soul for a price." One of the group stepped forward, raised his right hand, and tossed a shining object into the scales pan. It landed with a metallic crash. Smith leaned in, whispered something to him, then turned again to face the others. "Blood for gold," he repeated. "Every ounce of gold pays for a life. An enemy's life, bought and paid." One by one, each man stepped up. They raised a hand, placed their offering of gold into the balance, and bent to hear whatever Smith whispered to them. Each time the scales tipped lower with the weight of their contribution. Then Smith's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Gold for desire. For every pound of gold, the fulfillment of your cravings. Whatever you want, for a price." Again I watched the same ritual. The men advanced one after another, placing their gold on the scales, and each time Smith leaned in close, speaking low into their ears. The scales clanged and settled with each new piece of gold, and the air around them seemed to grow darker, heavier, as if some unseen curse were thickening with every bargain struck. The raised hands, the gleam of metal placed in the scale, the hushed whispers, and the intense, dark emotions etched on every face. It all unfolded before me. Then I saw each man return to Smith once again. They seemed to exchange quiet words. I could tell Smith was giving instructions, perhaps explaining some process. He gestured occasionally, pointing as if showing a direction, and once or twice moved his hands rapidly, clearly indicating that the path ahead was plain and unmistakable. My focus was so fixed on watching Smith that I barely noticed anything else. Then, with a sudden jolt, I realized the canyon was now completely empty. Just moments before, I had seen those same sinister figures gathered below, the full circle of them, with two standing slightly apart near the rock. I must have looked away for only a moment, but when I glanced back, they had vanished. Every single one. Terrified and speechless, I made my way back to the house. Overcome with exhaustion, I fell asleep immediately. I'm sure I would have slept for hours more, but I woke up just as the morning sun was starting to shine in through the window. I jolted out of sleep, feeling as though I had been struck by some invisible force. Disoriented, I sat up and was shocked to find 3 men in my room. One had his hand on my shoulder and was speaking directly to me. "Time to get up, mister," he said. "Your time's up now, I reckon. The boys are all waiting outside, and they're in a real hurry. Come on now, go ahead and get dressed. It's kind of cold this morning." The other two men exchanged cold, crooked smiles, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. I simply got up, pulled on my clothes without question, and told them I was ready. "All right then," one of them said. "You lead the way, Nichols. Jim and I will give the gentleman a hand." They led me outside into the clear morning light, and only then did I begin to understand the muffled noise I had vaguely noticed while I was getting dressed. A crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered outside, with some women among them. As soon as they saw me, a low growl of voices rippled through the crowd, an ominous, angry murmur that chilled my blood and sent sweat running down my face. I still had no idea what I had done to provoke such hostility, but I could feel the crowd's anger pressing in like a storm. Everything around me was a blur, a sea of moving figures, harsh voices rising above each other. Not a single face showed the slightest trace of mercy. There was only a wild, dangerous energy in their eyes, a mixture of rage and some deeper, darker hunger I couldn't name. Before I fully realized what was happening, I found myself marching as part of a slow-moving procession up the slope of the valley. Men armed with revolvers surrounded me on every side. Every so often, a voice would cut through the noise, and I caught fragments of shouted words and sentences, but nothing that made a clear story. Still, one phrase kept returning in different forms. A repeated curse, a cry of damnation. I heard bits of stories being passed between people, tales that sounded unbelievable and strange, and I had no idea how or why they were connected to me. Men, deceived by cunning traps and taken from their homes, were subjected to horrifying tortures, left writhing like wounded serpents in dark and desolate places, their only plea being for someone to end their suffering with a fatal stab to the heart. I heard another voice speaking of innocent young women who had disappeared for a day or two, only to return and die, their cheeks burning with shame even in the throes of death. I tried to make sense of it all and wondered what fate awaited, but exhaustion weighed heavily on me. I moved forward as if in a dream, barely longing for anything except to sleep. Finally, we came to a stop. We had reached the top of a hill overlooking Blue Rock Valley. I recognized the spot beneath a cluster of trees where I had often rested before. Surrounded by a circle of armed men, I noticed several of them busily stacking wood, while others were handling a length of rope. Then a disturbance arose in the crowd, and a man was pushed forward. His hands and feet were bound tightly with cords. Though his face was cruel and villainous beyond words, I felt a pang of pity for the torment twisting his features and distorting his lips. I recognized him. He was one of the men I had seen gathered around Smith in Black Gulf Canyon. In an instant, he was stripped bare, carried beneath one of the trees, and a noose was fastened tightly around his neck and the trunk. A harsh voice barked an order. Feet rushed forward, and the rope tightened. Before my eyes, I saw the man's face turn black with agony, his limbs convulsing in the shameful struggle of death. One after another, half a dozen men, all familiar from the previous night's gathering in the canyon, were strangled before me, their lifeless bodies dropped onto the ground. Then there was a pause. The man who had woken me earlier approached and said, "Now, mister, it's your turn. We're giving you 5 minutes to settle your affairs, and when that time is up, by the living God, we'll burn you alive at that tree." It was then I fully woke and realized the terrible truth. I shouted, "Why? What have I done? Why do you wish to harm me? I am an innocent man. I have never wronged any of you." I covered my face with my hands, overwhelmed by the pitiful horror of such a dreadful death. "What have I done?" I cried again. "You must have mistaken me for someone else. You don't know who I am." The man beside me sneered, "You black-hearted devil, we know you only too well. There isn't a man within 30 miles who won't curse Jack Smith while you're burning in hell." "My name isn't Smith," I said, clinging to the last shred of hope. "My name is Wilkins. I was Mr. Smith's secretary, but I had no knowledge of his dealings." "Listen to the liar," the man spat. "Secretary, indeed. You were sly enough, no doubt, to slip out at night and hide your face in the shadows. But we've hunted you down at last. But your time is up. Come along." I was seized and dragged to the tree, where heavy chains were fastened around me. Around me, piles of wood were stacked in a heap. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the dread. Suddenly, I felt a cold liquid pouring over me. When I dared to open my eyes, I saw a woman grinning wickedly as she emptied a large can of kerosene over me and the wood. A voice called out, "Light it up!" And then darkness took me. I fainted and lost all awareness. When I finally opened my eyes, I was lying on a bed in a sparse, cheerless room. A doctor held strong-smelling salts beneath my nose, rousing me back to consciousness. Beside the bed stood a gentleman, whom I later learned was the sheriff. He spoke kindly. "Say, mister, you had a mighty close call. The men were just about to set the fire when I arrived with the posse. I barely managed to pull you away, I can tell you that. I don't blame the boys, though. They had made up their minds that you were the leader of the Black Gulf gang. At first, nothing I said could convince them you weren't Jack Smith. Luckily, a local named Evans who came along with us recognized you and vouched that you were yourself. So we brought you in and locked you up, but once you're over this feint, you're free to go." The next day, I boarded a train and 3 weeks later found myself back in London, once again nearly penniless. But from that point onward, my luck seemed to turn. I gained influential friends in every circle. Bank directors sought my company, and editors practically threw themselves at me. I had only to choose my path. Eventually, I decided I was suited to a life of relative ease. Almost effortlessly, I secured a well-paid role connected to a thriving political club. I now enjoy a charming apartment in a central neighborhood near the parks. The club's chef does his utmost to please me during lunch and dinner, and the finest wines are always at my disposal. Yet since returning to London, I have never felt truly safe or at peace. Each time I awake, I shudder, fearful that Smith might be standing at my bedside. Every step I take seems to edge me closer to a precipice. I knew Smith had escaped the vigilantes' raid, and the thought that he might return to London, unannounced, filled me with dread. Each morning, as I left my home, I scanned the street anxiously, expecting to see that dreaded figure waiting. I lingered at street corners, my heart pounding, sickened by the thought that a few quick steps could bring us face to face. I avoided theaters and music halls, fearful that by some cruel coincidence he might be sitting near me. Sometimes, against my will, I had to walk outside at night. In silent squares, shadows made me shiver. In the bustling crowds, I told myself, it must happen sooner or later. He will come back, and I will see him when I feel safest. I scoured newspapers for any sign of impending danger. No small notice or trivial report escaped my notice. Especially, I pored over the advertisement columns, hoping for a clue, but found none. Months passed without incident. Though I still felt far from safe, the unbearable weight of constant terror lessened. This afternoon, as I strolled quietly down Oxford Street, I looked across the road, and there, at last, stood the man who had haunted my every thought. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed our recording, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss any future audiobooks.